So we're going to go ahead and begin. This evening, we do have a guest with us, uh, Captain Joe Lingeza, who's a colleague of mine here at the flagship Niagara League, is going to be joining us to help field some of the questions in the Q&A. He'll be typing in the Q&A chat there. So if you have questions and he can answer them, he'll be doing that. He started sailing in 1998. Is that right, Joe? On Niagara?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Joe is the director of sail training with the flagship Niagara League, and him and I work pretty closely on the sail training programs that we have on the ship. So really appreciate him being here to help field some of the questions. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll still be answering questions for anybody who has some left over at the end. So Joe, do you have anything you'd like to share before we get started?
No, if I don't know the answer to your question, I'm sure I'm fully qualified to make something up on the spot, and look forward to doing this with everybody.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Joe. Appreciate you being here. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get into it. For the Zoom chat here, I am going to be just putting it to panelists only, so you can still write in the chat, but Joe and I will see those. We had some people comment that they are getting a lot of pop-ups on their phones or devices during the presentation. So just to help people be able to see and not be too distracted by those, I will throw the chat on again at the end so that you can talk with each other at that point as well. Also, join the Facebook group if you haven't already. I have been sharing posts and photos and then updates about the course. I also will send the weekly email with the self quiz so you can help, kind of test yourself on those type of things. If you do have any logistical issues, please feel free to give me an email. And then today we'll be reviewing the rigs and the sails that we started with last session. And then we'll be going into Build a Brig, introducing all the spars and the standing rigging of Niagara. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So review here in terms of the types of rigs that we're thinking about. So we talked about last session, Niagara is a brig, and in particular, she's a snow brig. And we're going to be talking more about that, about what makes her a snow brig. But what it really comes down to is she has a very small mast right behind this after mast called the main mast right here. That's called the snow mast, and we'll be talking more about that. But yeah, Niagara is a snow brig, two-masted, square-rigged on both masts. Like we said last week, full-rig ship, three-masted, all masts are square-rigged. One of the more popular types of rigs are the schooner that you'll see throughout the world, and one of the more popular types of traditional sailing rigs because of the ease of in terms of number of crew that you can have on board, as well as the reduced costs in operations. Have a review of Niagara's sails. We're going to start with kind of naming the mast just to start off with. Now, we're going to go over this a little bit more as we go through today's session. But over here in the forward part of the ship, we have the head rig, the fore mast, we have the main mast. So our sails and most of our rigging is going to be named associated with those kind of parts of the ship, in particular the foremast and the main mast. So starting forward, we're working our way aft with the forward aft sails. We have the flying jib, if I can type it correctly. That sail, as you might be able to see, show you right here. Down here, the tack of that sail, or the lower corner, is not all the way down to the boom. That's because that sail is considered flying because it can go up or down higher depending on how much light air you want to catch with it. just got rid of everything, so that's all right. So yeah, again, flying jib. The next sail further aft than that is the jib. Then we have the fore top mast stay sail. That fore topmast staysail is bent on to the fore topmast stay. And we'll be talking about the stays today. Then moving to the what I would call the tweensails, or the fore and aft sails in between the mast, we have the main stay sail. The one above that is the main topmast stay sail. And then above that is the main top gallant stay sail. Lots of words there. And then finally, the after fore and aft sail is the spanker. Moving on to our square sails. If you remember, the lower square sails are going to be a course. So this is going to be the fore course, or fore sail, or fore sol. If you remember, we like to abbreviate terminology here in maritime language, so we can say it quickly. So foresail there. Above the foresail, we have the fore topsail. Above the fore topsail, we have the fore topgallant, or to'gallant, as we'll say. And then above that, we have the fore royal. And the royals, in particular, they're not considered set standing. They're not always rigged up. We have them on deck and stowed, and then we actually set them flying, which means we set them from deck, and that allows us to reduce the amount of weight we have aloft. Then we have the main course, or mainsail. Above that, we have the main topsail. Above that, we have the main to'gallant. And above that, we have the main royal, which, as we stated before, the royals aren't rigged standing. They're set from deck and sent aloft. So you can see, in particular with the square sails, there's a lot of those that are going along the same in terms of their terminology. You're just switching whether it's the fore topsail or the main topsail. In terms of the language of rigging, like I said, on board the ship, we have our own language, and everything on board is going to have a name, and that name is going to be associated with the side of the ship it's on, whether it's port or starboard, if there's two of them, main or fore, depending on what mast it's going to or associated with, what specific mast, yard, sail the rigging goes to. So if it's the main topmast or the fore to'gallant, so you're saying fore, main, to'gallant, or it could be starboard, fore, main, to'gallant, something. What specific mast, yard, sail the rigging goes to, and then the name of that rigging. So everything does have a pattern to it. It's just learning that terminology, and we're going to be getting into that today. So we're going to be introducing the spars that make up the rig. So all the wooden pieces, and we'll talk more about that. The standing rigging that holds the spars standing, or the mast standing and all together. So put it into place. And we're going to put it all together and build a brig from the hull up at the end. So spar. Spar is referencing to a long, sturdy pole, wood or metal. In regards to Niagara, it's going to be all wood. And they're used as the main structure as a sailing vessel. So think of the skeleton of the ship are all the spars. So that includes the masts that go up or out. That includes the yards that protrude from the masts, or the booms that protrude from the masts with the sails bent onto them, as well as a gaff. And there's a phrase, all yards are spars, but not all spars are yards, if that confuses you enough. But the idea here is a spar is all the wood pieces that make up that skeleton of the ship. And so that's where we're going to begin, because that's where we begin on a ship. Here we have a whole bunch of names for ships that have a bunch of masts. You can see on the top one there, you got fore, main, middle, mizzen, jigger. We're going to be focused on the forward two here, which a brig carries, which is going to be the fore and main. And then we have a bowsprit as well. So masts. So we have a fore and a main mast, but those masts aren't one large pole going all the way up to the top. They're made of sections. So first we're going to start with a lower mast, which is going to be the largest mast, down low. And you can see here on the right on the picture, that's the main mast on Niagara. Then we're going to go up to the topmast, which is the next level up. And it's going to be a smaller diameter mast. And then as we go up further, we're going to have the topgallant mast. And on this diagram here in the middle and on Niagara, the topgallant mast and the royal mast are actually the same spar. The royal mast just decreases in diameter at the point where it shifts from being the topgallant mast and the royal mast. So they're not different pieces of wood or spar, but they are treated as two different spars when we're rigging the ship and rigging those masts. At the lower end of the lower mast, where the mast goes through the deck through the hull, we're going to have some terminology here. The mast step is where the mast actually sets down onto the keelson rider, it's called, but one of the structural timbers inside the ship in the center line. That's where the mast step is going to be, and that's where the foremast, or here the main mast, is going to set into. The point where the mast goes through the deck is called the partner, and that's going to be a point where it's going to have additional structural timber there to support that area. And then once the mast is in a position through the partners and in the mast step, then wedges are put in to keep that mast secure. And once you have that, then the mast is secure, the lower mast is secure enough that you can then move on to actually rigging that mast without fear of it moving on you. But that's how the masts go through the deck and where they sit in the ship. Continuing on, we have a diagram or a picture here showing the masts of Niagara. This is actually, I believe this is in Cleveland of 2019. This picture was taken. But again, we start with the lower mast, so the main, the fore. Then as we work up, we have the topmast. So the main topmast, the fore topmast. Then we continue to move up, the main topgallant, the fore topgallant, and then finally the main royal and fore royal. And I'm going to try to say this terminology as much as I can, because I think one of the easier ways to kind of learn terminology and a new language like this is going to be repetition. So I'm going to try to say it a lot and introduce these concepts and terminology over and over throughout the sessions. And I recommend you kind of, as you're practicing your build a brig or kind of drawing out the ship, do that same type of process to try to learn the terminology here. Some other pieces that make up the rigging in terms of terminology that I want to introduce here so that it'll assist us with trying to talk about things later. One important one here is on the right, where the two different masts overlap is called the doubling. So that point where you have the lower mast, the top of the lower mast there as cap, and then you have the heel of the topmast here, that whole section there is called the doubling. And it makes sense. That's where the two masts are doubled up right there. Another area that I want to point out on the left here, and some terminology. So here we have a mast. These pieces of timber here are called the trussel trees. And then we have the cross trees that cross over the trussel trees and create an opening right here. And that's actually where the lower mast, or sorry, the next mast up, either being the topmast or the topgallant mast, depending what this is, will actually go up through. And then that's how the doubling is formed. We also have here what's called bolsters. Those are going to fit in right next alongside. That's what a lot of the standing rig is going to rest on. And then we have the mast cheeks right here alongside that will give some support to the trussel trees here, and also be where that mast is kind of guiding up in between the cross trees in this area here between the trussel trees. Some additional terminology that making up our spars and how they're all fitted together. So at the top of each mast, we're going to have a cap. Again, we have the doubling between the lower mast and the lower part of the topmast. So that's the doubling again. On board merchant ships, you would have what's called the top. But because Niagara is a warship, we have a fighting top. That fighting top does consist of the trussel trees and the cross trees, but it's also a platform that's fairly large. This allows us to also increase the angle for some of the rigging that we're going to talk about. But for a warship, you would actually have Marines up on that fighting top acting as snipers on the enemy vessel, trying to take out some of their crew. But we don't use that for that purpose today, obviously, but it is a good platform for people to stand up there. And it's a nice, large, comfortable platform for people to transition going up into the other part of the rig in the topmast there. Another spot I want to point out is what's called the hounds. So the hounds are where the standing rig rests. So we don't actually have the standing rig go to the top of the mast. It goes through a part at the cross trees and trussel trees. There's going to be a point, we call that the hounds. At the top of the mast, right up here, the top topgallant mast, that is the topgallant hounds. So there's some rigging that comes down off of that, which we'll talk more about. And that's the point where the mast changes from being the topgallant to the royal, is right there at the topgallant hounds. So we have the topgallant hounds there. Then we have some topmast hounds at the cross trees and the trussel trees there. And then we have the main hounds right there at the fighting top, again at the trussel trees and cross trees. So the hounds are where the actual rigging sits on the mast. So some other spars in the head rig. So first we're going to talk about the bowsprit. The bowsprit is this section. It's actually what we refer to as almost a third mast. So that bowsprit protrudes from the deck, and it's large enough to be a third mast or third lower mast for the ship. So we have a fore, a main, but then the bowsprit is also a large spar that everything else is rigged off of. And then coming out from the bowsprit, the next spar out is the jib boom. And then the next spar out from the jib boom is the flying jib boom. And you can probably guess the jib is set off of the jib boom, and the flying jib boom is set off of the flying jib, or so the flying jib is set off the flying jib boom. And one thing I would point out as well is as you start going out, just like in the masts, how they go, as you go up, the spars get smaller. as we go further out from the bowsprit to the jib boom or to the flying jib boom, those spars also get smaller as well. We also have the martingale. The martingale is goes from the bowsprit cap. So the bowsprit itself also has a cap, and the martingale protrudes down from that. And its purpose is to provide an angle for some of the rigging, like from the flying jib boom here, because otherwise that rigging there would have to go straight back, and it wouldn't have enough angle to give a proper force down for that flying jib. So that's the real purpose of that martingale there. And then I want to talk about the sprit yard. So we have the sprit yard here that's hanging underneath the bowsprit. Historically in previous kind of evolution of sail, the sprit yard would have had a sprit sail. But as you get into the early 19th century, riggers and ships are going away from use of a sprit sail, but we're still using the sprit yard primarily to, again, for rigging and supporting the head rig. So we have the flying jib boom and the jib boom here. We have some rigging, and you can see the angles of that rigging that the sprit yard allows. And if you don't have the sprit yard, you wouldn't be able to have the effective angles to provide support for the flying jib boom or the jib boom. So now we're moving kind of back to the spanker, again, which is the aftermost fore and aft sail. And it has some spars that are associated with it. So the first main one I want to talk about is the snow mast. So you can see it here pretty clearly. The main mast is painted orange there, but the foremast is urethaned. And so you can see the natural wood color there. And its purpose is to allow us to rig the spanker and bend on the spanker to the snow mast itself, and not all the way around the very large mainmast. So that's really its purpose, is for rigging the spanker to it. Some other spars that we have the spanker gaff and the spanker boom. So the spanker gaff has the head of the sail, or the top of the sail, bent onto it. And on a ship, on a square rig ship, the spanker, in terms of like Niagara, it's always, the spanker gaff is always hoisted aloft, and the sail is brailed in or set out. So we don't actually lower that gaff to take in the sail. We actually haul the sail in. The lower part of the sail here at the foot, it's called the foot of the sail, is actually what's called loose-footed. So the foot of the sail is not bent on to the spanker boom, but the very outward corner called the clew, and then a line called the clew outland or clew outhaul, allows us to pull the sail out. So the sail itself is loose-footed, but the clew of the sail is pulled out to the end of the spanker boom. And you can see from the size, the spanker is one of the largest sails on the ship. It takes a lot of people to set, but it provides a lot of sail area far aft on the ship. Next, we'll talk about yards. So yards are what the square sails are going to be bent onto and what they set to. When the square yards or the yards are not being used with the sails, and they're not being hoisted, or they're just in place and secure and rigged, one of the pieces of the rigging that's important to have, you're going to have a yard sling. So that's going to be for the lower mast. It's going to have a tie and a sling associated with it. But for all the yards, they're going to have what's called lifts. So in the little drawing on the left there, you can see there's two crew member They're standing on foot ropes. What allows them to do that is, and this picture is a little bit different, but it's going to be these lifts that are going to prevent. So if you have force down on one end, the other lift right here is going to prevent that side from going down. So when the yard is in its lifts, it's supporting the yard so that it can't, its angle can't be changed based on weight or somebody laying out on it. So the lifts are very important for keeping the yard secure. But the yards are those horizontal spars that cross the mast that we bend sail onto. Here's some more examples of that terminology of the lifts in practice. So right here we have the lower lifts. And again, this allows crew to lay out onto the yards and they won't start going down to deck. And then on the right picture here, as I mentioned, we have crew standing on the foot ropes. And then on Niagara, before people lay out onto the yard, they're all wearing harnesses. They've all been through a loft orientation. They've done an open over with the crew so that they can get a chance to go aloft without having work to do, so they can get orientated and accustomed to the ship and climbing on it. And before they lay out into the yard, they clip into the back rope so that they're clipped in when they're laying out and when they're doing the work on board the ship. So going through the names of the yards, they're going to be very similar to the sails we've already talked about. So first we're going to have starting up forward, we're going to have the foreyard. That's going to be the foresail, or the forecourse is going to be bent onto. Then we're going to have the fore topsail yard that the fore topsail is going to be bent onto. Next one above that, we're going to have the fore topgallant sail, or sorry, topgallant yard, which the fore topgallant sail is bent onto. And then above that, we're going to have the fore royal yard. And again, the fore royals, or the royals, are not standing. And then we have the main yard on the mainmast there. In this photo, the main yard doesn't have the mainsail bent onto it. In most seasons, that'll often be something that we'll wait till mid-season to bend onto. Next yard up, we have the main topsail yard, again, which the main topsail is bent onto. Then we have the main topgallant yard, which the main topgallant is bent onto. And then the main royal yard, which the royal is bent onto. And the royals are actually stowed, when they're taken down, they're stowed on deck all the way down here on what we call the gallows. And then they're set from deck all the way up. And it does take some crew. And it looks like in the main topgallant here, we have a crew member who was up there. So it looks like we might have just set the royals, or we're about to take them in this photo. So standing rig versus running rigging. So the standing rigging supports the masts and the other spars of the ship. So they keep everything in place. So we're going to be talking about stays and shrouds, backstays. They're going to be holding mast in place. And then the running rigging is used to set, take in, or adjust the sails, to adjust the trim. So it's in use daily depending on the operation. So the running rigging is moving while the standing rigging generally stays in place. That's not always the case. There are going to be some parts of the standing rig in terms of if we're going to consider lifts for the yards, the lowers have running lifts, so we can adjust those. But in reality, they're part of the kind of the standing rig of that yard. Types of standing rig, as I said, the stay, which is going to support the mast from forward. So in this case, like right here, this would be a mainstay Then we have a main topmast stay. We have a main to gallant stay. So the stays are named from the mast that they're coming up from and down. So what mast do they support? So those are the stays. We also have the forestay, fore topmast stay, fore gallant stay, and there's additional stays, but we're going to stick to ones here. Then we have the shrouds. The shrouds give lateral support side to side, port to starboard. So we have the shrouds here, port and starboard, supporting the mast. So those would be the lower shrouds or the main shrouds. So we have the starboard main shrouds, the port main shrouds. Then we have the topmast shrouds, which go down to the edges of the fighting top. Then we would have the topgallant shrouds that would go to the end of the cross trees. Underneath the cross trees or the fighting top, we have what's called futtock shrouds. And they just allow us to rig the topmast shrouds against something. Because if we just rigged the topmast shrouds and pulled against the fighting top, well, then it would start curling up. So that's why we need to have futtock shrouds to prevent that, and those futtock shrouds go directly to the lower shrouds. And I do believe we'll see more of that in this session here. And then finally, backstays. The backstays, the lower shrouds do not have backstays. The lower shrouds, the lower mast doesn't have backstays. The lower shrouds act as a backstay. They go far enough aft that we don't need a rig backstays for it. But we do have backstays for the topmast. We also have backstay for the topgallant mast. And we also have a backstay for the royal mast. So that would be for both the main and for the fore. Components of the standing rigging. So here's some basic terminology of that. So here I'm showing we have our dead eyes. This is for the shrouds. There's another very, so these are the dead eyes here, and they're going to have these cylindrical holes cut into them through the what's called the dead eye, and that's what these what's called lanyards are rove through. So we have our lower shroud here that gets seized around and rigged to the dead eye. Then the lanyard goes through a dead eye at the top and a dead eye at the bottom. And we tune those lanyards or tighten them. And then we use the seizings here, which these are going to be synthetic marlin. And that's what we use to actually tension. And then the seizings are what we use to secure those lanyards. And that's really what's keeping the ship in place, is all these different seizings throughout the ship. So I think it's pretty amazing that the whole ship is tied together with these knots and seizings. And as you go down smaller and smaller, you're just using friction to keep everything in place. And it's amazing how well and efficient or effective it works. Another type of kind of way for shrouds or stays to use a lanyard would be a heart, which is going to be, instead of having all these holes drilled, it actually be open with some grooves. I think we'll be taking a look at that in our next session next week and talking more specifically about some of the rigging there. Here we're starting to get into the shrouds. So on the right hand picture there, so you can see the lower part, we have our lower shrouds. This one here, this is what's called the swifter shroud. It's the forwardmost shroud. It has some serving on it, meaning some marlin has been served tightly or wound tightly around it. And that's going on each one of these. In terms of the shrouds here, so the swifter shroud is specifically named. Then after that, we would have, this would be the port main shroud number 2, port main shroud number 3. You can see these lines here. These are called ratlins. So as crew climb up aloft, they're holding on to the shrouds because those are really secure and in place, but they're putting their feet on the ratlins. So it's like a ladder climbing aloft. Then as we go up, this is what I was talking about. We have the futtock shrouds here that are counteracting the topmast shrouds. So above that, we have the topmast shrouds, the topmast shroud lanyards. Then we have some ironwork and some hooks. And then we have the futtock shrouds that go directly to the lower shrouds. There's a little bit more going on here, but those are kind of the basic parts. And we're using the futtock shrouds, which are attached to the lower shrouds, and pulling against them with the lower or the topmast shrouds to get those tight or tuned. And the gallant shrouds also have, they're actually attuned from the fighting top, but the gallant mast has shrouds. It's only the Royal that doesn't have shrouds. And the reason for that is the Royal isn't set standing, correct, right? Remember, the Royals aren't staying up there all the time, so we don't need anybody to climb up there to get onto the yard. So the Royals don't need to have the shrouds there for that support. But they do have a stays and backstays. So next, I want to talk about the head rig, and that's where everything begins. So when we tune the ship or make everything tight and go from one mast to the next mast, it all starts in the head rig. So when we build a brig, and as you're going through and doing your own practice build a brigs, try to go through the parts of the ship, I would recommend starting with the head rig, because that's the process of how we're going to rig the ship. So here we have, everything's going to start. We have the bowsprit, so that's going to be the first thing out. Then pulling down on that bowsprit, we have the inner and outer bobstays. So the bobstays are kind of the first stays in the ship, and so we're pulling down. And actually, when we're tuning that bowsprit, we're probably pulling down on the bowsprit with upwards of 10,000 pounds, trying to pull it down so that we can get those bobstays nice and tight. Because after that, everything else is going to be rigged off of those. So then we have the inner and outer forestays. So most of the rigging on a warship like this in this time period, they're going to double up on the rigging, on the standing rigging. Because if you're thinking about it, they're a warship, they're going to go into battle. If you have one of the stays shot away, you'd be pretty good to have a second one there so the masts don't fall down and you don't get demasted. So having multiple stays in place help with that. So we have inner and outer forestays that counteract the inner and outer bobstays, and that's tuning the bowsprit there. And then we also have inner and outer fore topmast stays, including a jib stay, which is where the jib stay is going to go out to the end of the jib boom. And then we have some other stays all the way out to the flying jib as well. Here we're talking about the martingale. A more modern term when you get to the later part of the 19th century for that is going to be the dolphin striker. Usually the dolphin striker is going to be made out of steel, and it's kind of a little later in the evolution of sail, but it's a similar idea. But in this time period, it's called a martingale. In the lower drawing here, I want to point out the sprit yard here that's crossing underneath the bowsprit, and we have these jib boom guys. These are kind of like the shrouds of the jib and the flying jib booms. So we have an inner jib boom guy, an outer jib boom guy, and the flying jib boom guy. And so you can see there's a lot going on in the head rig. That's because a lot of the rig of the ship is starting there or protruding from there. And remember, this whole head rig here is a mast unto itself. So just like the foremast has its different parts, the head rig is going to have its parts. So overview, we have the spars, which are the skeleton of the ship. That means the mast, bowsprit, booms, gaff, yards, martingale, sprit yard. Then we have the standing rigging, which supports all the spars or masts and keeps them in place. So we have the stays, the shrouds, and the backstay. So now we get to the portion where I want to build a brig. So now we're going to bring it all together. And this is where the captain gets to start drawing. And I get to show you my artistic skills here on the computer. So we're going to start with, we already have our hull, we have our water in place. So we're going to start with our lower masts. So first I'm going to start in the head rig. So I want to give ourselves a bowsprit. I'm not going to make it too big, so I have some room here. So there we have our bowsprit. Then I want to give us a foremast. And then I'm going to give us a mainmast. And in terms of differentiating between the foremast and the mainmast, obviously the foremast is forward of the mainmast, but also the mainmast is going to be taller than the foremast. If we switched it, if the foremast was taller than the mainmast, then this would actually be a ketch and not a brig. But this is a brig. The mainmast is taller than the foremast. So there's our lowers. Next, we're going to go out to, we're going to have our jib boom. Actually, I'm going to go a little bit smaller there just because we're going down in diameter. So we have our jib boom here. Then we have our topmasts. So our fore topmasts and our main topmasts. And remember, the two areas where the two masts overlap is going to be our doubling. Then going up one more level up, we're going to have our flying jib boom in the head rig. Then we'll have our topgallant mast and our main topgallant mast. So our fore topgallant and our main topgallant mast. Now remember, the royal is going to be the same, part of the same spar, but it's going to be a little bit thinner at the topgallant hounds. So I'll just draw it a little bit thinner here. We have our main royal, and then we have our fore royal. So there we have our bowsprit, jib boom, flying jib boom, our lower mast, topmasts, topgallants, and then royals above that. So we have some more spars to add. So I'm going to start with the head rig, and I'm going to add a martingale. The martingale is going to start there at the cap of the bowsprit, protrude down like that. And I'm also going to add, let's try to choose a color here that'll work for us. The bowsprit's tough to draw here, so I'm going to draw it at an angle. But it's going to cross underneath the bowsprit and be horizontal, parallel to the surface of the water. But easier to draw it at an angle like that. Next, I'm going to throw on the spanker spars. So we're going to have the snow mast behind the main mast there. Then we're going to have our spanker boom. And then we're going to have our spanker gaff. We're getting there, but we're not quite there. We still need some yards. So first we're going to have, and again, these are going to be horizontal, but I'm going to draw them at an angle. We're going to have our foreyard. So I'll draw that a little lower. Our foreyard here, and our main yard. The next level up, we're going to have our fore topsail yard and our main topsail yard. And I'm putting these yards, the topsail yards, in place, the topsail and the gallant yards, so that they look like they're set, so that I'm going to draw in the sails as well at the end. But in terms of where they usually are, if they're not set, they're lower down because the halyard or the yard hasn't been hoisted yet. But that's where I'm putting the topsail yards. Then we're going to go to our gallant yards here. And that's how we're going to leave it for now, because again, our royal yards are sent from deck, so I'm going to leave those off. Then I'm going to throw in some of our other parts of the rig here, and I realize I jumped the gun a little bit with the yards, but so remember we have our fighting tops. I'll actually make that a little thicker there. So this will be our main fighting top, our fore fighting top. Remember, each mast also has a cap. So we have our main cap, our fore cap. And as we work our way up, we have our main topmast cap. Then we'd also have main topmast cross trees, or trestle trees, and then cross trees. Same here in the fore topmast cap. Then we'd have our trestle trees and our cross trees as well. And then again, the gallant mast isn't going to have a cap or cross trees because that's associated with the royal, right? So the royal shifts at the hounds, and no one goes above the gallant hounds because there's no shrouds, so we don't need to have cross trees there. Now we're going to start getting into our stays. And I'm not going to be drawing out all the stays. I'm just going to be kind of drawing in the main stays and shrouds that we have in place here. So first we're going to start in the head rig. And the first one we're going to draw is our bob stays. So our bob stays are going to come from the end of the bowsprit and then go to the hull, again, pulling down that bowsprit. Then countering that bob stays, we have the fore stays. Now the angle here is a little off, obviously a little bit artistic interpretations here, but that is the fore stay. Again, the stays hold up the mast or support the mast from forward. Next one up we're going to have is the fore topmast stay, going to the end of the bowsprit, and then we also have a jib stay that also comes from the top of the hounds of the fore topmast, goes to the end of the jib boom. Let's go ahead and go to the main mast there. For the main mast, we're going to have our mainstay. And there's actually going to be, again, there's two sets of stays in most locations. With the main, it's actually pretty noticeable because one mainstay goes to the after part of the foremast, and the other mainstay goes to the starboard side of the foremast, and then goes forward of it to a set of hearts there. So those are our mainstays. Then next level up, to support the topmast, we have, you guessed it, the topmast stays, or in particular, the main topmast stays. So the main topmast stays goes from the main topmast hounds, and then it's going to go down forward to the yard below it. And last thing we want to throw in there, we want to make sure we get the gallant supported. So we're going to have the gallant stays. We're also going to have royal stays. There's also a flying jib stay. But again, all these stays are going to be doubled up. We're going to try to stick to kind of the basic terminology. So really, as you're kind of drawing this out and practicing and kind of going through the motions, and as we're going to talk about it, we're going to talk about it, it's coming from a mast. And what is that stay doing? It's supporting it. So just know what the name of that mast is, and you'll know what that stay is. So we have the 40-gallon stay, 4 royal stay. Then we're going to have ourselves a main to gallant stay, and then a main royal stay. So those are our stays supporting the mast from forward. Next, we're going to talk about back stays. So what's the stays that support behind or aft of the mast? So for that, new color here. So again, the lower masts aren't going to have back stays, but we're going to have a set of back stays for the topmast. So that's the main topmast back stay. And with the back stays and the shrouds, we're either going to have a starboard or a port. So a starboard main topmast backstay or a port main topmast backstay. Next level up, we're going to have a starboard or port main to gallant backstay. And then finally, we have the main royal backstay or starboard or port main royal backstay. One thing that's significantly different with the royal backstays, they're actually running, which means we can adjust in real time, depending on what the conditions are, we can adjust the tension of those backstays. Whereas if they were just rigged standing, we couldn't adjust them quickly. But those are set up so that we can actually adjust those quickly, only for the royal backstays. Then on the foremast, we have the same setup. We have our 4 topmast backstays, our 4 to gallant backstays, and then our 4 royal backstays. So those are the backstays supporting the mast from behind. Now you'll see the stays that support the mast from forward have a greater angle, which, if you're thinking about it, they're going to have a greater force in terms of keeping the mast from going back or falling aft. Whereas the backstays are going to have a much steeper angle there, so they're going to not have as much force, I guess, or preventative power against that. And the part of that reason is, and I haven't drawn it in here, but masts on ships like Niagara and most sailing vessels are going to have what's called rake. And rake is going to be let's see if I can draw it real quick. So let's say we have the deck of a ship. If a mast is straight up and down, there's going to be 0 rake. But if it's angled at a slight angle, it'll have an after rake to it. And advantage to that, it does have some advantage in terms of how we can brace yards around. But the main advantage is in terms of the rigging. It means that you don't have to have as much support aft in terms of angles for backstays, which allows you to have more room for sails or spankers or things like that to be able to let those out to catch the wind, rather than having to have these backstays have the similar angle. So the masts actually lean back or aft a little bit at 3 to 7 degrees, depending on the mast, and then the stays support them, and that's what makes the stays so crucial. And also when a square rig ship like Niagara is sailing, the wind is predominantly behind the mast. So it's pushing either from the side or from behind. And so then again, the raked mast helps with that because the natural angle of the rake helps fight against that force of the wind. And then it's most dangerous for a square rig ship when the wind comes back or on the forward edge of the sail when you don't expect it to or you don't want it to. So those are kind of the little bit differences and nuances there. And that's kind of an example of rake. But I'm not drawing in the rake here. The next part of the standing rig that we need to support our mast is going to be our shrouds. So next we'll put our shrouds in. So the lower mast shrouds coming from the hounds, We're going to have a set of 5 here. So these are going to be the four shrouds. And in particular, since we're looking at the starboard side of Niagara here, this would be the starboard 4 shrouds. Then on the main, we're going to have the main shrouds, or the starboard main shrouds in this drawing. And there we go. Next level up, we're going to have the topmast shrouds. So the topmast shrouds are going to go to the outboard side of the fighting top. And then again, they're going to be counteracted by the futtock shrouds underneath. And that will tie in the topmast shrouds to the lower shrouds. And then we have the same here with the starboard main topmast shrouds. And then the starboard futtock shrouds, or starboard main futtock shrouds. So there we have the main topmast shrouds there. Next level up, as we go, we're going to have the topgallant shrouds. So topgallant shrouds are actually going to go through the topmast cross trees, and then they're actually going to continue down and cross and go to the fighting top. And so there's a starboard section, or starboard topgallant shrouds, and the port topgallant shrouds were on the main or the fore. And so the fore will be the same. And obviously we're showing everything as if it's on the starboard side, except for the cross here is the 2 different sections of those topgallant shrouds. But we have topgallant shrouds that support the topgallant masts side to side, just like the rest of them. So, and then again, the royal masts aren't going to have shrouds because the royal yards are not set or rigged standing. So we set them from deck, so therefore we don't need to have shrouds supporting that mast. Really the backstay and the sail being attached to the gallant yard is going to give enough tension there, in addition to the halyard as well once that sail is set. And then we can throw some sails on there. So this is where I start getting freehand with the build-a-brig. We have already put our spars or our sails on there. So I want to start with some of our square. I'll start with the fore and aft sails, as we do. So again, starting with the flying jib. Gonna have a flying jib bent onto the flying jib stay. We'll make a brighter color here. Then we're going to have our jib bent onto the jib stay. And we'll have our fore topmast staysail bent onto the fore topmast stay. So that's why it has that full name of fore topmast stay, because it's bent onto the fore topmast staysail. And so those are our headsails there. Then in between the masts, we have our main staysail bent onto the mainstay. Then above that, we have the main topmast staysail bent onto the main topmast stay. And above that, we have the main topgallant staysail bent onto the, you guessed it, main topgallant stay. So again, they're named after the stay that they're bent onto. The stay is named after to the part of the mast it's supporting that it goes up to the top of. And then finally, back aft, we have our spanker set here on our spanker boom, spanker gaff, and bent onto the snow mast. And then finally, we're going to throw some square sails on there. We are a square rigger after all. So first, we're going to have our, I think I've almost used all the colors here. First, we're going to have our mainsail or main course, our foresail or forecourse. The courses, or the lower square sails, they're going to be different than the other ones because those sails get set to deck, So there'll be lines on deck that we tend for those. And then above that, we have the main topmast or main topsail. And you'll see the corners of that sail. The running rigging goes to the yard below it. And that's a crucial part of these yards and how they interact. Then we have the fore topsail. That's bent onto the fore topsail yard, which is then hauled out to the lower yard. Above that, we have the fore topgallant. And then we have the main topgallant. And then let's say we have nice day out there. We want to set more sail. Let's go ahead and throw our royal up. And we'll set our main royal and our fore royal from deck. And there we have it. That is the basic components of Niagara's rig. I think one thing I do want to kind of explain a little further in terms of some of the standing rig that I didn't put in here because I didn't want to clutter it up too much. But let's talk a little bit about lifts, in particular for the yards. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clear my drawing. And I'm going to go ahead and put in our lower mast. So we have our main mast. Ooh, I'm going to go ahead and make that a little bit bigger. So we're going to have our main mast, our foremast here, throw the bowsprit, give ourselves a topmast. Then I'm going to give us fighting top, a cap, fore fighting top, foremast cap. And then I'm going to put some yards here, some lower yards. So we're going to have our main yard, and we'll have our fore yard. So these lower yards are the only ones that actually don't get lifted up. They're rigged in place for the whole season. And so they have a sling and a tie that is associated with them. We're not going to get too much into that, but they are hanging at the hounds underneath the fighting top there. But you can see where they're hanging from is in the center of the yard. So if we put somebody out at the end of the yard, what's going to happen to the other end? So this part will go down, this part will go up. So the only way to prevent that is we need to put some type of standing rigging on the yard to prevent it from going up or down on the ends of the yard. So that's called lifts. And I'll go ahead and draw those in. And so the lift for this side is going to go up. And then for the lowers, they actually go down to deck. The other yards will be up higher in the rig. And then we have another lift that goes up and back down. So now that we have the lifts, now that if we put someone on the end here, the lift itself is preventing this side from going down. And so that we don't have the yard changing angle up or down. So that is the purpose of the lifts. On Niagara, the lower yard lifts in this diagram, they're actually what we call, again, running. And we can adjust them in real time and do every time we move the yards around, we actually take the lifts off. But for the topsail yard and the topgallant yard, those lifts are standing. So let me throw a topgallant mast on here. So we'll throw a topgallant. Oh, that's an arrow. We'll throw a topgallant mast there. Again, we have a royal as well. And then we'll throw topsail yard. So here we have a topsail yard, the 4 topsail yard crossing, and actually I'll put it where it normally would sit when it's in its lifts. So we'll have a 4 topsail yard. You can see it's lower down on the mast there, and then it's going to have a set of lifts that attach to the, I'll go another thinner diameter there, that attach to the end of the yard, go up, and then they actually go down to the fighting top, and they are actually secured to the fighting top or around the fighting top at the cross trees in what's called a knot called round turn and 2 half hitches. It's a very simple knot. It's in the seamanship handbook. It's easy to tie, but it's amazing how versatile it is. And this is actually one of the real important use of that that we use for these lifts. And again, if we have a person, one of our crew, go out to the end of the yard arm, the lift is going to prevent that person from forcing the yard down. So that keeps the yard in place. So that is the purpose of the shrouds there. All right, so that's build a brig. I do have a blank build the brig on the course page, or if I don't, I will have it tomorrow so that you can print it out and actually draw your own build a brig. I also have the terms on there of the things that you want to put on your build a brig to give you a little hand so that you can get through and actually think about what you might want to put on there, or what you need to put on there to support the mast and rig. So now we're at the end here. So some of the things I want to, I'll go through the rest of the Q&A here that Joe's been working really hard with all of you to try to answer your questions. So if there's any more there, I can answer them. And for next week, visit the page. Again, I have resources set up for the next session. I'll set up there. Join the Facebook group. There's a reading suggestion on the course page. And to review your sail and spar plan and use that to help you get through your own build a brig sketch. And I would also recommend that when you get that sketch done, you can actually do a few of them, depending on how easily it's coming to you, and then label them so you have that drawing for the future as well. So that can help you learn the terminology too. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my video on here. And I'm going to go ahead and see if there's any questions left. If you are, if you don't want to stay further around for the Q&A, that's fine. You can go ahead and get out and carry on with your evening. I'd like to thank everybody here for joining me here, and I hope you have a good week. So I have a question here from Michael. Are the topsail? Oh, it looks like Joe's actually answering it right now. So.
Yeah, I'm about 20 minutes behind here in answering questions.
Okay,
so,
no, that's fine. I mean, I'll probably be able to answer these relatively quickly, and we're actually pretty good on time. So this is great. So Michael, you have the topsail and the gallant lifts tightened when the sail is set, or they let loose. So those topsail and the gallant lifts, when the yard is hoisted, those lifts go slack. And they stay like that, and then when the sail is taken in, then they get the lift, or the yard gets set into its lifts, as we say, so or lowered into its lifts. So they are not tightened; they stay like that, and they're whatever they're rigged as. They just go slack when it's set, and then they go tight when it's eased down again.
Chris, I'll take this one on rake if that's all right.
Oh, please do.
It was give you a chance to breathe a little bit.
Sure.
So the quick answer to why are the masts raked, i.e. Tilted back, is that it was fashionable at the time. Now the longer answer is you always want a little bit of rake at least. Otherwise, the lines coming down from various points aloft all end up at the same point on deck. If you rake the mast a little, then they tend to spread out more as they go down. specifically in American ships in this period, you have a pattern of development from colonial times when there were a lot of decent trees, but not a lot of decent places making rope. So you would simplify the rigging of a small to medium-sized boat by having one biggish mast and one piece of standing rigging going forward. So the mast is leaning back, the standing rigging is pulling forward, and that more or less stabilizes the whole thing. You don't have to have anything stabilizing it going back because it's already leaning back. And that is carried on through designs into almost the 20th century in American ships, especially, and it was perceived to be fast. It was perceived to be a more effective way of spreading out your sail area. There's not really a lot of science behind that, but that was the feeling at the time.
All right, thank you, Joe. And then here's from Rico. When you set the topsail, do you tighten the lifts or are they slack? Again, we answered that there. They are slack. You're welcome, Jeremiah. Gerald, how long? Go ahead, Joe.
How long does it take to rig Niagara for the season? What's our record, Chris? Like a couple of weeks, a month?
I would say at least, I mean, the shortest time, probably a month to get it up to probably topness. But yeah, usually it's about 5 to 6 weeks is usually our time period. You're welcome, Anthony. Good to have you. Jersey, in terms of seaman manuals and from merchant ships, in terms of learning about the rigging, Joe, I mean, you can have some input here as you like. There's one expensive one that I think is really useful is the Seamanship in the Age of Sail. Has lots of drawings and a lot of easy to understand descriptions of terminology and things like that. But it usually is $50 to $100 as a hardback book. On the course page, I did provide a link to the Lever Young Sea Officer Manual there. So that is under the resources page there for our course. That is free. It's because it's so old. It's not copyrighted, so we can just have a link, and that's a Google, I think a Google book link there. So that would be one there. Joe, would you have any others that you'd recommend?
Yeah, I mean, Darcy Lever is the best thing in print for under $20, I'd say. And then, yeah, if you want to get into the archival stuff, there are various sources. But if you go to Google Books, set a top date of like 1850 or 1900, search for seamanship, you'll get a lot of good hits. And there was a lot of repetition in these, so they would rip each other off freely. So if you get 3 or 4, I think you'll get the dominant opinions of the times.
Yeah, and the Google Books actually, they do have a vast resource of old-timey, in particular 19th century seamanship manuals from those people who are, like Joe was saying, ripping each other off and kind of rehashing different materials. So they're all free and they're sometimes they're a little hard to get through, but those resources are there. Mike, Joe appreciates all of your great answers.
I'm doing my best here. How is the snow mist secured to the main mist? Like this. I mean, it's not stayed independently, but there's a socket at the bottom and a socket at the top, and it's like Lego joints, and it's just rigidly stuck in there.
Yeah. And we actually had to replace that at the before the 2019 season, a couple of years ago. We replaced that snow mast. Oh, we did have a question about whether or not the Q&A will be available for download. That's something I'll look into. I'm sure Joe had a lot of great answers to your questions. I'll see if I can download that and provide that on the course resource page. It's possible I can't, but if I can, I will. Go ahead, Joe.
Maybe we just alternate here.
Sure.
Is the Royal considered a flying sail? I'd say the way we do it, yeah, it's set flying. In various periods, I guess it's been at least 10 years, but we used to keep the Royals rigged all the time, aloft all the time, and we'd call that rigged standing. So in theory, you could have one half of Niagara with the Royals set rigged standing and one with set flying. But yes, the short answer.
And even one season where Joe and I were mates, a little over 10 years ago, we had one captain come aboard and wanted them rigged standing, so we did. And then the next one would come back on board, and he wanted them set flying, so we had to down rig them and put them back on deck. So don't be that captain. Life goals. Correct. The martingale was often called the dolphin striker, and later more like steel ships as the evolution of sail carried on. So I wouldn't use them interchangeable in this time period. So I would call the Niagaras a martingale.
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
If you use the other term instead of the right one, we'll know what you're talking about.
Yep.
For doubling up on the stays for war, are the stays then loosened to both be half the tension of what a single stay would be? How would that work? No, effectively, they're both about the same tension, and they're both about the tension that just one would be.
Yep. Here's from Dennis. Rake makes the ship look scarier, e.g. Pride. Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes it look, at least faster, I would say. It does have some advantages in terms of bracing yards around a little bit and things like that, but as Joe said, not scientifically based, more about preference.
Reefing.
We're gonna talk about reefing briefly when we're talking about sails. So I'll talk about the reef points, why we reduce sail and reef. We're not going to get too heavy into it, but Ronald's question is, are you going to go over reefing? And then he's interested in talking about the spanker and how it gets reefed. The gaff does come down to get reefed, and we do have a reef point that allows us to, with reef nettles, where we are able to reduce the square area of the sail. So we do ease the gaff down, we reef the sail, and then we hoist the gaff back up, and then it gets set pretty much the same as it would be if it was full sail. So, but we will briefly talk about it in a few sessions ahead, or a couple sessions ahead, where we talk more about running rigging and in particular the sails itself.
What does it mean when a ship misses her stays? Going through stays is going through the wind to tack. So missing stays is trying to go through the wind and you don't quite, and you go back down the other way.
All right. Why won't allow me to answer live? Oh yeah. Just doing it. Michael here, are the topsails ever set from already raised yards or just using the sheets? No, primarily we'll just, the order for setting those yards or those sails is the sheet home first, or to get the sheets out and then hoist the yard from there. I don't think I've ever seen an advantage to doing it another way. I'm sure a situation could come around and do it.
Seen quite a few pictures of the Niagara with a main course sail, often unfurled. What determines that sail being furled or unfurled? Okay, so the mainsail is like 85% redundant with what the spanker does in terms of how it pushes the boat. So usually we won't have both set unless we're in very specific circumstances of a point of sail and wind conditions, or if we're trying to have everything up there so it looks like we have everything up there because it's a parade or something. What determines it being furled or unfurled? Unfurled is just ready to use. And the mainsail, we'll have it unfurled so it's ready to use in a situation, especially a parade when people are taking pictures. But we'll have it in stays in its gear, because functionally, when you're tacking around and doing things like that, it tends to interfere with the functioning of the spanker. Chris, maybe you can take a crack at that. I'm not sure I was entirely clear there.
Oh, you mean in terms of the mainsail?
Yeah.
Yeah. The mainsail will tend to backwind, as Joe was saying, the spanker. So it's not really very effective unless you have a perfect point of sail or with the wind in the exact right direction. The mainsail often creates the wind to push into the back side of the spanker and decrease the efficiency of that sail. So you end up going a little slower unless you're in the perfect sailing point of sail with the wind in the right spot, which we actually had in 2019 on Lake Michigan. We were in a race with Pride of Baltimore 2. We had everything set, and we even had the mainsail set, but we did what we call goose wing it, where we actually haul up the leeward clew of the main course. So we reduced some of that backwinding, and we had a good broad reach going that allowed us to keep both sails full. So Jason, question here. Question, shall I continue to apply for ship's cook since I have a decade or two career? Jason, we haven't posted any position available right now. We actually kind of have a ship's cook that we had on hand. Did you send I guess you sent your resume already to us. Looks like your ultimate goal is to learn from deckhand up to captain. So definitely getting on a toll ship is the way to do it. I'll see if I can get my hands on your resume and reach out to you, and we can have a conversation. Right now, we're unsure about when we'll be able to sail this year, if we're going to be able to sail. And we've been pretty lucky to be able to have a ship's cook in years past come back, but who knows what's going to happen this year. But yeah, I'll try to reach out to you, Jason. You're welcome, Caden. Good to have you. Ed Hale.
Hey, Ed. Good to see you.
Talk to you or talk at you. When do you fly the Jolly Roger, Joe?
I do not.
Neither do I. Niagara is a warship, naval vessel. So her actual job would actually be to hunt pirates. So maybe you could get where we go from there. So it's one of those kind of I wouldn't say sensitive, but it's one of those things that we have to kind of give and take with in terms of pirates. That idea, because you can imagine Joe and myself. We've been doing this for a couple decades now as professionals, and we have licenses and gone to school and had training for it. So at this point, although we appreciate the kind of pirate mythology and the cultural phenomenon that brings people to these ships and makes them fall in love with it, we try to kind of reduce the amount of pirates on board the ship. In particular, Niagara is a warship, so she would have actively fought pirates, but we can have a good time too. We actually go to a pirate fest on the west end of Lake Erie every June normally on the island of Put in Bay, and that's always a good time. And I think one year we actually hung a skull and crossbones or a skeleton from the yardarm as part of it about a decade ago. That was good fun.
Can any of the sails be tacked? Bill here. Yes, tacking means going from one side of the wind to the other. So you can move the whole ship from one side of the wind to the other, or you can move, the nomenclature as an individual sail. So when you're tagging the ship, the fore and aft sails, you tack them over from one side to the other. And you can do that regardless of whether you've flipped the whole ship over. If you want to do something like heave to, which is the nautical equivalent of putting the parking brake on. But yes.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to sails. In terms of anybody who's sailed on a kind of more modern vessel that you don't have yards, the yards can be moved around, called braced around with braces, and we'll talk more about that as we go along. how does the spanker compare to today's? I think you want to say spinnaker sails. Um, the spinnaker sail is usually going to be at the bow of the ship or bow of your vessel, your sailboat, your yacht, and the spinnaker is for going downwind. So because a modern sailing vessel doesn't have yards and square sails, which are designed specifically for going downwind, the spinnaker is a light wind sail, or a sail that you can throw up quickly using your spinnaker pole and spinnaker halyard, and it usually is at the bow and you're going downwind, so it allows you to have a lot more sail area than just your very small Marconi rigged uh, three-sided sail there at the mainsail. So that's really what your spinnaker is doing. The spanker is on the opposite end. It's on the after part of the ship, and actually we don't have the spanker set when we're going downwind. So when we're going downwind, we're really using the squares, and the spanker actually comes in, it becomes more of a liability than actually a help. So that's kind of the difference between the spanker and a spinnaker. They're actually on two opposite different ends and have different uses. The spanker is going to be more for when you're on the wind or on a beam reach.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some kind of linguistic connection there in, old Frisian or something.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, different sails. Approximate total weight of all spars. I have no idea except to say several tons.
Yeah, it's hard for me to even guess at that. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about maybe 10 tons if you put them all together. If we're talking tonnage, that'd be about 20,000 pounds, maybe a little less than that, but anywhere from 10 to 20,000 pounds, I would say. When you get all the lower yards, topsail yards, togallant yards, royal yards, and then the sprit yard. We're talking about all spars. Yeah, I mean the lower masts are about 10,000 pounds themselves. So no, you're talking more probably you're working out your way up to 50,000 pounds, probably of spars plus.
Yeah. We're better with numbers that we have to deal with frequently.
Yeah, we could calculate all that if with the weights of each spar, but it wouldn't be something that's particularly useful.
If you want to know how tall of a bridge can we get under, or how much space do we need to parallel park, I can tell you those in my sleep.
Yeah.
On the reefing, could you include a sail plan for wind strength, perhaps for a later session? I don't know if we have anything like that per se, but it all, in broad terms, the more wind, the less sail. Mm-hmm. So, we'll carry everything without a reef, including royals, up to, maybe 10, 15 tops knots. And then it just ratchets down from there until, when you're in a full gale. Niagara will do 8 knots without a stitch of canvas set, just on our bare poles. So, yeah, it's a continuum, and it's also based on other conditions like sea state.
Yeah, and I'll look to see if we have anything there. We do have a sail management plan, but that's more about when we're going to take in sail than reef. But yeah, can Niagara be tacked like a schooner? Not well. So Niagara, because she's a square rig ship in her design, she's going to get most of her power and most of her drive from the topsails. So if we took out the topsails and all the squares completely and just had fore and aft sail, in the right conditions, the spanker would probably have enough effort to maybe get you through. It's just if you can get enough speed going with just under fore and aft. So I would imagine you probably could, but really the ship's going to have a lot of probably leeway with just the fore and aft sails and not a lot of drive to her. So you probably could, but we generally will have the topsail set when we're maneuvering the ship and in particular tacking.
And I think there are two separate questions here. Can it be tacked? Can it go through the wind in the same way that a schooner does?
Oh, I see.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, maybe a little less efficiently than a schooner does. And the other question, which I think Chris answered, is if you take away all the square sails, is Niagara a good schooner? And we tested some of that maybe 20 years ago. And it turns out if you take away the square sails, you have a bad schooner left with just the spanker and the jibs and the other fore and aft sail.
Mm-hmm. And actually, you know, in the right conditions, she'll, you know, we'll talk about tacking in the last session in the sailing evolutions. But one of the parts of that evolution is a mainsail haul, which is with the main stack, and it's pretty important in some conditions when you're tacking a brig like Niagara. But in the right wind conditions with low seaway, we can actually get the ship around pretty quickly, and not even the mainsail haul is less important. But that's in the rare conditions. That is the Spinnaker from David. Okay. Question here from Mike: will the course get into decking and planking, i.e., caulking, oakum, pitch, etc.? We actually don't get into that. We kind of stick mainly to the rig and sailing. Basically, you know, kind of the idea being sail training. You're stepping on deck, the ship is rigged, and we're to go out sailing. What do you need to know? So we will talk a little bit of marlin spike seamanship and kind of a little bit more micro in terms of how the ship is put together in the next session, but we're not going to get into how the hull itself is put together.
I'd say maybe in a future class.
Yeah.
We could you know, the longer we're locked up here in our ivory towers, the more likely it is we'll have more content.
Yeah.
Mike Foreman, have you had a chance to visit the Oliver Hazard Perry, another tall ship? Any thoughts or observations of another newly built ship? Yeah, I think Chris and I have both been on board the OHP. They're doing sail training, so we're all in favor of that. And I think we've seen between us probably most of the ships in the U.S. and Canadian fleets. And, you know, any ship is a compromise. So, you know, it's steel hull. It's got a lot of systems. It's got, you know, air conditioning, which would be nice. And it's ocean going. So it's an entirely different species of animal than Niagara, and good for entirely different things. But yeah, we know them, we like them, we wish them the best.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're part of our tall ship or our sail training family here in the U.S. And we're glad they seem to be doing pretty well and having some good programming there in Rhode Island. So, question here from Jerry: do we sell T-shirts or hats? We do have a ship store or a museum store. You can visit sailfnl.org. That's our website for the ship, and you can go to the museum store there, and we have a bunch of number of items that you can merchandise you can buy on there.
What kind of wood is preferred for masts and spars? Daniel here. Usually softwood, like in our case, Douglas fir, some kind of pine. You're looking for something that's strong relative to its weight, is not too heavy, and grows straight without a bunch of gaps or checks in it. So something like oak is a very strong wood, but it tends not to grow straight for 100 feet at a go. It tends to develop cracks in it as it dries, and it's really heavy. So the preferred mast and spar wood would be Douglas fir, something like that. Oak is good for hulls, as is pine, fir, and we use ash for blocks traditionally. And to get back to a question that was in the chat earlier, we do have some exotics like Purple Heart, Santa Maria, what have you, as pin rails, things like that. And those are tropical woods that are almost close to metal in their characteristics.
So kind of a comment here from Bill. You're welcome there, Bill. And again, we're going to talk more about that in the last session about all the actual steps of actually attacking Niagara and wearing ship or jibing Niagara as well. So that's great. Yeah, we you've sailed on Lady G. Howard and Pioneer. That's cool. The obviously we have Lady G. Howard here. Um, she's a great ship to sail. Obviously a lot different than Niagara, but she's a joy to sail as well out here in Presque Isle Bay on Lake Erie. Joe, who actually steers the brig?
A couple of goons.
Whoever we can
So-
pull off the beach there.
So you have the functional equivalent of a bridge team of 4 to 6 people, and the officer who has the con, the person who's actually driving the whole school bus, is standing on a quarter deck above everything, watching the big picture. We'll have 2 people on deck with relieving tackles, pushing the tiller back and forth. On usually the direct commands or the compass commands of the officer with the con, because they can't see anything. They can't see over the side. And we'll have somebody on lookout and maybe somebody on throttles too.
Yep. All right. How close can Niagara go? So most modern vessels can go about 45 degrees, unless you start getting into the high performance sailing vessels. Schooners, you're looking more like 55 to 60 degrees. Square riggers, you generally can do about 65 to 180 degrees, depending on the rig and the type of square rigger. Niagara is a little bit better than that. We can get about 65, 70 degrees to the wind, but that doesn't include leeway. So we'll usually have about 5+ degrees of leeway as well. So all in all, that ends up being more like 70 to 75 degrees close to the wind in terms of what we'll actually be able to do as a course over the ground. That's if we're lucky. Depending on the wind conditions, the sea conditions, the sails that we have set, as well as who we have steering, can vary how close we are able to get to the wind and how efficiently we are able to sail on the wind. So that varies, but generally it's about 70 degrees, 65 to 70, and then obviously leeway on top of that. And leeway is the amount of the ship tends to go sideways through the water. And that leeway isn't a lot, but it's a lot over a long period of time if you're not sailing effective. So if you have more leeway, you're going sideways more than well, you're still going forward more, but you have more loss sideways away from the wind.
Yeah, the short answer is on any kind of square rigger, think of where you want to go and you can't get there.
Yeah.
Any insight on if we can get on Niagara this summer? We hope. Watch the news. We're in the same sphere of facts and suppositions that everybody is. So we would very much like to have Niagara going this summer, but it's unclear.
Yep. We will see. Spruce, too late, from Ronald. I think you're talking about in terms of spars. I haven't seen many spruce in terms of spars. Have you, Joe?
I've never heard of it. I mean, this stuff tends to be regional. So you use the stuff that grows where you are. And here in the US in the 21st century, we're using the trees that are left. So somebody may have used spruce somewhere for something, but for those of us building ships in the 18th through 20th century on the Great Lakes, no.
Question here from Christopher Finnegan. Christopher, good to have you with us. Christopher was an apprentice on the ship, helped with uprig a couple of years ago. Do you know when shear poles and cranelins were introduced? I don't really have a good handle on that. Joe, do you have any sense of when in the evolution of sail they were on board in terms of rigging?
I can take a wild guess, Foot ropes were introduced like way later than you would think, like 1750 or something. So cranelands, I would think, are probably later, probably when you're getting schooners kind of taking over. So if I had to make a stab in the dark, I'd say 1800. Um, shear poles again. Um, so in the big bathtubby square riggers of the Middle Ages, you would quite often down rig the swifters, the front legs of the shrouds, to get them out of the way, so you could tack the yards around a little bit more and maybe go kind of at right angles to where you were trying to get to. So I think shear poles are going to come in once square riggers are becoming more weatherly, and you're thinking of those forward shrouds as something that are fixed in place all the time. So I would say post 1750. Don't cite me in your paper on that, but post 1750.
I find it interesting, like the major advancements in technology for like rigging and ships, you know, and obviously ships during this time period are the spaceships of their day. You know, the advancement of technology was like when it became easier to do something or safer to do something for the crew, or for doing things aloft. So that gets in with we talk about jack lines as well in terms of or jack stays on yards and things like that. So yeah. Uh, Jersey here has what dimensions of lines are used for sheets and halyards and other lines. Most of our larger running rigging is going to be 7/8 of an inch. Um, and then from there we'll go down. So most of the halyards, the lower braces, sheets are going to be about 7/8. And then as we get to parts that have less strain or force on them, then you'll have smaller diameter lines as well. But yeah, 7/8 is generally where we start off there. Sometimes you'll find 3/4, but mostly 7/8.
Are there, from Bill here, are there lines in the sails to pull the sails up to the yards by the crew leaning over the yards? No. Generally, the way you do it to furl up the sails is you get a dozen of your closest friends, and you all reach down over and grab whatever you can. And it's hard to grab and inconvenient, and it tears off the ends of your fingernails. And somehow it works out. But there are reef points which you can get a hold of, but there's nothing provided for the convenience of the sailors.
Yeah, and a part of that too is one thing we'll get to in a later session when we start talking about running rigging is the sails do have running rigging that bring the sails up to the yard. So as then Joe, as he was saying, the crew lay out and then they can pull up the sail, by huffing it up from there. But the sail is brought up with that running rigging or gear, which we'll talk about in another session. Paran here has a question about a boat building course. We actually don't have a boat building course. What you might be seeing is that with some of our volunteers that we have here locally, I was doing some training for them, which was for ship construction there. So that wasn't, we were just talking about the parts of the hull and things like that. So that wasn't a course we were teaching the public. That was just some training I was doing last fall with our volunteers.
Let's see. I'm a little confused by the diagram. Is the flying jib attached to the fore royal stay and the jib to the fore topgallant stay, or is there separate flying jib and jib stays?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm winging this a little because I don't have to put that stuff up there very often anymore. I'm either a desk jockey or standing at the back of the boat looking important. But the fore royal stay and the fore topgallant stay are provided there to keep those two masts where they're supposed to be. and the jib and the flying jib stays will be a little lighter, and they'll be, if I'm not wrong, they'll go to the base of the mast. So there's a little more structural support. Am I thinking of the right ship?
Somewhat, yeah. So, like we were talking about, in terms of most all the stays are going to have two components. So you're going to have a fore royal stay um, and a fore to gallant stay, but you're also going to have a separate flying jib stay and jib stay, which I'll get more into next week to try to clear out that confusion. So I'll draw that out specifically. Tonight I was just trying to use very generic. Each mast has a stay that supports it from forward. But yeah, coming next week, I'll use that as an example of the gallant and the royal and explain that and use a diagram so everyone can see.
Edward Bright, would not American privateers be seen as pirates by the British? Yeah, I mean, privateering is kind of
Great.
eye of the beholder thing.
Yeah, every nation, seagoing nation at that time would give privateers, license to pillage other nations' commerce and merchant vessels. But yeah, obviously the enemy would see them as pirates for sure. We are a warship, so we're not a privateer. So would the British have seen the Pride of Baltimore too as a pirate vessel? Probably, maybe in spirit, but obviously they're at war with the whole United States, so it doesn't matter if they're a privateer or not. Glad you had a good session there, Ronald. It is definitely a full session with lots of terminology, so glad we got everybody through it. We got through our Q&A here, so Joe, I'd like to say thank you for all your help there typing in and for going back and forth with me answering these questions. It definitely make it a lot less talking for me, so I appreciate that. And I think overall the session went smoother, and we're done before 8 in time for your class. So yeah, as we sign off here, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody who joined us. Again, visit the course page for all those resources. And next week, we will continue building on our terminology that we learned this session. We'll start with building a brig again and move on from there. So have a great night, everybody, and a great week till we see you again next week. Take care. Be safe.